Bloodied human bodies littered the dark corridors of the Kaitia communications array, but the surviving soldiers refused to stop fighting. Captain Henry Turner ducked plasma fire that singed the wall behind him, checking his rifle's magazine. Only 3 rounds left, 3 rounds to defeat an empire. Henry's 5-man infiltration team, the best of the best from humanity's elite special forces, had already lost 2 men assaulting this linchpin Cation outpost on a remote frontier planet. Their covert mission: destroy the array, disrupt enemy communications, and maybe, just maybe, give humanity's battered fleets and armies a fighting chance in this bitter war. The Cations, once humanity's tentative allies, now their most hated foes. When the 2 species first met, they greeted each other as friends, the humans in awe of the Cations' sleek, powerful ships and advanced technology, the felinoid aliens impressed by humanity's tenacity, bravery, and refusal to back down from any challenge. But the amity was not to last. Both races hungered to expand their frontiers, to claim the rich worlds and resources that lay between their star systems. Diplomacy turned to tension, tension to rivalry, rivalry to conflict, and conflict to all-out war. Now, after years of bloody stalemate, the Cations had the upper hand. Their ships were faster, their weapons more powerful, their stealth systems more advanced. They struck human colonies and ships at will, appearing as if from nowhere, destroying their targets, and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. But the humans kept fighting. Sergeant Ramos, Henry's second-in-command, grunted in pain, blood seeping from the wound in his thigh. Henry gritted his teeth, firing his rifle. 1 round left now. They had to get those explosives planted on the array's reactor. Ramos tossed Henry his last grenade. Pulling the pin, Henry hurled it down the corridor, scattering the Cation guards. In the moment of confusion, the humans sprinted for the reactor room. They burst in, quickly rigging the charges. Henry's finger hovered over the detonator button when an alarm blared. Soldiers poured in, weapons blazing. Henry's men fell, one by one, until only he was left, standing over Ramos's bleeding body. He looked at the detonator, then at the Cations. With a roar of defiance, Henry raised his rifle and charged. Henry's battered ship, the Defiant, limped into the forward operating base's hangar, smoke trailing from the hull breaches. The ship shuddered as it touched down, the scorched metal groaning. Henry unbuckled himself from the pilot's seat, his muscles aching from the hours-long running battle. He stumbled onto the hangar deck, medics already rushing past him to the Defiant's crew compartment. Henry watched as they carried Ramos out on a stretcher, the sergeant's face ashen, his thigh wound bleeding through the field dressing. "Prep the surgical bay," one of the medics shouted into his comlink. "Critical patient incoming." Henry clenched his fists as Ramos vanished through the hangar doors, guilt and anger warring inside him. He wanted to chase after the stretcher, to be there when his friend woke up, if he woke up. But there was no time. A young ensign ran up to Henry, saluting quickly. "Captain Turner, Admiral Graves requests your immediate presence in the command center," the ensign said, slightly out of breath. Henry nodded grimly, following the ensign through the bustling corridors of the base. They entered the command center, a large room dominated by holographic displays showing fleet movements and star maps. Admiral Graves, a tall, imposing figure with close-cropped grey hair and a face lined with stress and responsibility, stood at the central table. "Captain Turner," Graves said, his voice tight, "I'll skip the pleasantries. The situation is dire. The Cations have launched a major offensive, led by a massive dreadnought under the command of General Corvus himself." Henry's blood ran cold at the mention of Corvus, the ruthless Cation general, who had become his personal nemesis over the course of the war. Graves manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on a planet. "Their target is Arcadia Colony, our main supply hub in the sector. If Arcadia falls, we lose our foothold in the region, and the Cations will have free reign. The colony must be evacuated before the dreadnought reaches it." Henry stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Admiral, let me take my team and infiltrate that dreadnought. We can sabotage it from the inside, take it out before it gets to Arcadia." Graves shook his head. "No, Captain. I know you and your men are the best we have, but infiltrating the dreadnought is a suicide mission. I can't afford to lose you." He fixed Henry with a steely gaze. "I need you to lead the evacuation. Take whatever ships you can muster and get our people off Arcadia before the Caitians arrive." Henry wanted to argue, but the look in Graves's eyes brooked no dissent. "Yes, sir," he said through gritted teeth. Henry stalked out of the command center, his mind racing. He had a job to do, and he would do it. But if there was even a chance to strike at Corvus and his dreadnought, he would take it. The next hours passed in a blur as Henry assembled his task force, requisitioning every ship he could get his hands on. Cargo freighters were hastily outfitted with whatever weapons were available. Fighters were fueled and armed. And then there was the Phantom, a prototype stealth frigate fresh from the shipyards. It was fast, agile, and virtually undetectable, the perfect ship for a dangerous mission. As the ragtag fleet prepared to depart, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they were already behind. Corvus was no fool. He would have detected their ships the moment they left the base. It was a race now. A race to reach Arcadia and evacuate the colonists before the Caitian dreadnought arrived to slaughter them all. Henry stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Retribution, as the fleet emerged from hyperspace on the edge of the Arcadia system. He stared at the view screen, at the distant glint of the planet, and made a decision. "Helmsman, plot a course through the Persei asteroid field," Henry ordered. "We'll use it to cover our approach." His first officer, Commander Reeves, turned to him with a shocked expression. "Sir, that asteroid field is a death trap. Our ships will be torn apart." Henry met Reeves's gaze steadily. "Corvus's dreadnought is too big to follow us through the field. It's our only chance to reach Arcadia first." He turned back to the view screen. "All ships, follow my lead. Full speed ahead." The fleet plunged into the asteroid field, the huge rocks looming like mountains on all sides. The ships wove and dodged, narrowly avoiding collision again and again. Henry gripped the arms of his command chair, his knuckles white, as the Retribution shuddered and rolled. Suddenly alarms blared through the bridge. "Captain!" the sensor officer shouted. "Caitian fighters approaching from the rear." Henry cursed under his breath. Corvus had anticipated his move and sent his fastest ships to cut them off. "All fighters engage the enemy," he barked. "Keep them off our backs." The space around the fleet erupted into chaos as human and Caitian fighters clashed, laser fire crisscrossing the void. Henry watched the battle unfold on the tactical display, his heart pounding. They had to get through, had to reach Arcadia in time. A massive impact rocked the Retribution, throwing Henry from his chair. He scrambled back to his feet, shouting for a damage report. "Direct hit to the engines, sir," an officer reported, his voice shaking. "Main power is offline. We're dead in the water." Henry stared at the view screen, at the Caitian fighters swarming around his crippled ship. He thought of Ramos, of his men who had died on the communications array. He thought of the colonists on Arcadia, waiting for a rescue that might not come. No, he would not fail them. Not now, not ever. "Reeves, you have the con," Henry said, his voice steely calm. "Get the fleet to Arcadia, complete the mission." Henry smiled grimly. "I'll buy you some time." He turned to the weapons officer. "Divert all remaining power to the forward cannons. Let's give these bastards a fight they won't forget." As the rest of the fleet pulled away, the Retribution turned to face the oncoming Caitian fighters, its guns blazing defiantly against the darkness. Henry settled into his chair, his eyes fixed on the view screen, his mind filled with the faces of those he fought for. "Come on, Corvus," he whispered. "Let's dance." The Retribution shook violently as the Caitian fighters pummeled its fading shields. Sparks erupted from overloaded consoles, filling the bridge with acrid smoke. Henry coughed, his eyes watering, as he frantically scanned the readouts. The ship's weapons were depleted, its armor shredded. They were out of options. Suddenly a memory flashed through Henry's mind. A seedy spaceport bar, a grizzled old smuggler spinning tales of his exploits. "If you're ever in a bind, kid," the man had said, his eyes twinkling, "just overload your fusion core. Turns your whole ship into one big bomb. Course, you gotta be crazy or desperate to try it. Henry slammed his fist on the intercom. All hands abandon ship. I repeat, all hands abandon ship. He turned to his bridge crew, his face grim. Get to the escape pods. I'll handle this. As the bridge emptied, Henry slid into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. He diverted all remaining power to the engines and set a collision course for the heart of the Cation formation. The fighters, sensing his intent, broke off their attack and scattered. But it was too late. Just before impact, Henry slapped the eject button, his escape pod blasting free from the doomed retribution. Moments later, the ship detonated in a blinding flash of light, the shockwaves slamming into Henry's pod and sending it tumbling end over end. As his vision cleared, Henry stared in disbelief at the scene before him. The Cation fighters were gone, vaporized in the explosion, but rising from the debris field like a monstrous spectre was a massive Cation warship, its hull painted in the colors of Corvus's personal command. Before Henry could react, a tractor beam lanced out from the dreadnought, ensnaring his pod and dragging it into the behemoth's hangar bay. The pod slammed to the deck, the impact throwing Henry against his harness. The hatch hissed open, and rough hands hauled him out, slamming him to his knees. Henry looked up into the sneering face of Corvus himself, the Cation general's eyes burning with hatred. Corvus grabbed Henry by the throat, his claws digging into flesh. "I've waited a long time for this, human," Corvus snarled. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long." Henry tried to speak, but Corvus's grip tightened, choking off his words. The general leaned in close, his fetid breath hot on Henry's face. "The attack on Arcadia was just a diversion," Corvus hissed. "My real target is Earth, and you, my dear captain, will have a front-row seat to its destruction." Henry was dragged to the dreadnought's bridge, a phalanx of guards surrounding him. He was forced to his knees before the main view screen, his arms wrenched behind his back and shackled. Corvus towered over him, savoring the moment. On the view screen, the blue-green orb of Earth grew larger, the human homeworld blissfully unaware of the apocalypse that approached. Corvus's eyes gleamed with anticipation, his claws flexing. "Broadcast the signal," he ordered. "I want every human to see this." Henry met Corvus's gaze defiantly, refusing to give the Cation the satisfaction of seeing his fear. "You're a fool, Corvus," he spat. "Even if you destroy Earth, humanity will never surrender. We'll fight you to the last breath." Corvus backhanded Henry across the face, splitting his lip. "Brave words," the general growled. "Let's see how defiant you are when I'm peeling the flesh from your bones." He began to rain blows upon Henry, his fists slamming into the human's face and body with brutal force. Henry refused to cry out, refused to beg, even as he felt bones crack and blood pour from his wounds. Just as blackness began to encroach on his vision, alarm suddenly shrieked across the bridge. Corvus whirled, his eyes widening in shock as the tactical display lit up with warnings. "Our cloak is down," a Cation officer shouted. "We're exposed." On the view screen, a sleek human frigate shimmered into existence off the dreadnought's bow, its weapons already charged and locked on target. Henry recognized it instantly. The Phantom, the prototype stealth ship. And at its helm, he knew, would be Commander Nakamura, his loyal XO. Corvus roared with rage, spittle flying from his jaws. He spun back to Henry, murder in his eyes, and was met with a headbutt that shattered his nose. Henry, seizing the moment of distraction, had lurched to his feet and slammed his forehead into the general's face. As Corvus reeled back, Henry snatched the sidearm from the general's belt. His first shot took Corvus in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second and third shots dropped the guards on either side. And then all hell broke loose. The Phantom opened fire, its advanced weapons tearing through the dreadnought's shields like they were paper. Explosions rocked the massive ship as consoles burst into flames and bulkheads buckled. Corvus's crew scrambled in panic, desperately trying to return fire. But the frigate danced nimbly through their barrage, its own guns never falling silent. Henry and Corvus, locked in their own personal battle, hardly noticed the destruction unfolding around them. They traded blows with savage fury, claws and fists and elbows and knees rolling across the deck in a tangle of blood and hate. A particularly violent jolt sent them tumbling off the raised command platform and onto the main bridge level. Consoles exploded around them, showering them with sparks and shrapnel. Overhead, the lights flickered and died, plunging the bridge into darkness, illuminated only by the hellish glow of emergency beacons. And still they fought on, neither willing to yield, even as the dreadnought began to tear itself apart around them. Explosions tore through the Caitian dreadnought, massive shockwaves roaring through disintegrating bulkheads. Twisted metal screeched as decks buckled and collapsed. Henry and Corvus battled savagely through the dying ship, hammering each other with ruthless blows. Blood and sweat splattered ruptured conduits. Corvus's claws raked Henry's face, his once pristine uniform shredded, matted with gore. "Even if I die, the Caitian fleet will burn your pathetic worlds," Corvus roared, pummeling Henry's ribcage. Bones cracked under the alien's relentless strikes. Henry spat blood, lunging into a ferocious counterattack. "Humanity will never stop fighting, even if I fall." His fists smashed Corvus's jaw with ruthless precision. "We'll battle to our last breath." The deck lurched violently beneath them, a chasm ripping open in the hull. Henry seized a dangling cable, the metal biting into his hands. Corvus scrabbled frantically for purchase, then plunged into the abyss with a howl of rage. Clawing up the cable, Henry dragged himself onto stable footing. He staggered through the shuddering ship, bulkheads groaning, consoles erupting in flames. He had to reach the hangar bay. It was his only chance. A plasma bolt sizzled past Henry's head, scorching a bulkhead. He dove aside, rolling to cover. "You will die, human!" Corvus stood at the far end of the passageway, his face a mask of battered rage. The general had hauled himself out of the chasm, murder blazing in his eyes. He fired wildly as Henry scrambled away. Plasma bolts stitched the corridor, blasting smoldering holes in the walls. Henry zigzagged desperately, diving through clouds of choking smoke. He burst into the hangar, Corvus's shots sparking off the deck. A battered Caitian fighter squatted in the hangar, scorch marks blackening its hull. Henry leapt into the cockpit, fingers flying over the controls. The alien ship shuddered to life. Corvus charged into the bay, rifle blazing. Plasma rounds pinged off the canopy. Henry punched the engines to full power. The fighter lurched forward drunkenly. Corvus raised his rifle, lining up a point-blank shot at Henry's head. With a shout of defiance, Henry triggered the fighter's guns. A hail of fire raked the hangar deck. Corvus dove for cover as the barrage chewed through the bulkheads around him. Thrusters flaring, the Caitian fighter blasted out of the hangar. Behind it, the dreadnought exploded in a blinding fireball, the shockwave slamming into the tiny ship. Corvus's howl of rage was swallowed by the maelstrom of destruction. Henry wrestled with the controls, narrowly avoiding the deadly hail of debris. As the expanding cloud of wreckage dissipated, he gaped in horror at the vista before him. Shattered hulks of human and Caitian ships drifted in the void, locked in the throes of a titanic space battle. Fighters swarmed like angry insects, plasma fire stitching the void. Capital ships traded devastating broadsides, hulls pockmarked with gaping wounds. "This is Captain Turner. Authentication Bravo Zulu 9er," Henry broadcast frantically. "Any UNSC ship, please respond." "Henry, is that you?" Admiral Graves's haggard face materialized on the cockpit display. The Admiral looked as if he had aged a decade. "Thank God you're alive. But the situation is grim. The Caitians are throwing everything they have at Earth. We're being pushed to the brink." Henry's mind raced. The battle hung in the balance. Every ship, every weapon could make the difference between survival and extinction. His gaze fell on a crippled UNSC destroyer drifting among the wreckage, its hull perforated, but core systems still intact. A desperate plan took shape. Henry dove into the Caitian fighter's systems, his neural implant interfacing with the alien code. Rewriting the command architecture, he slaved the derelict destroyer's weapons and engines to the fighter's controls. It was a jury-rigged, tenuous connection, but it just might work. "Admiral, I have an idea," Henry said, steel in his voice, "but I'll need the fleet to buy me some time." He outlined his audacious gambit. Engines flaring, Henry plunged into the fray, the battered destroyer lumbering behind him like a wounded leviathan. It was time to take this fight to the enemy. Henry guided the battered Cation fighter into the destroyer's hangar, the emergency containment fields flickering weakly. He set down hard, the deck shuddering under the impact. The fighter's canopy cracked open, acrid smoke billowing into the dim hangar. Henry hauled himself out of the cockpit, his boots clanging on the scorched deck. He swept his gaze across the cavernous space, taking in the twisted wreckage of smashed shuttles and mangled equipment. A few escape pods still sat in their berths, their hatches sealed tight. Henry allowed himself a flicker of hope. Maybe some of the destroyer's crew had made it out before the Cations crippled the ship. He pushed forward, picking his way through the debris-strewn corridors. Emergency lights pulsed weakly, casting eerie shadows across buckled bulkheads. The air was thick with the stench of burnt insulation and spilled coolant. The only sound was the ominous groaning of the ship's tortured superstructure. Henry made his way to the bridge, the door hanging half off its hinges. He stepped inside, sweeping his sidearm across the smoky compartment. To his shock, a dozen haggard figures stood hunched over the flickering consoles, their uniforms stained with sweat and grime. At their head was a tall, wiry officer with Lieutenant Commander's bars on his collar. The man whirled, his hand dropping to his holster as he saw Henry's Cation flight suit. Henry quickly raised his hands, pulling off his helmet with a hiss of released pressure seals. "Easy, Commander. Captain Henry Turner, UNSC Navy." The officer relaxed fractionally, his hand easing away from his sidearm. "Lieutenant Commander Singh, XO." His voice was rough with exhaustion. "What the hell are you doing here, Captain?" Henry crossed to the tactical display, the holographic projection fritzing with static. "I've got a plan to take out the Cation flagship, but I need this ship to do it." Singh barked a humorless laugh. "In case you hadn't noticed, Captain, this ship is barely holding together. Our reactor is one hiccup away from going supercritical." Henry met Singh's gaze, his jaw set. "If we don't do something, the Cations are going to roll right over the fleet and burn Earth to a cinder. This ship is the only thing big enough to put a dent in that flagship." Singh hesitated, looking to his ragged crew. They met his gaze one by one, determination etched on their faces. Singh turned back to Henry, giving a tight nod. "All right, Captain, we're with you. What's the play?" Henry allowed himself a grim smile. "We're going to ram this destroyer right down that flagship's throat." The crew leapt into action, coaxing life back into the damaged systems. Consoles lit up as power thrummed through the ship's ravaged circuits. The deck shuddered as the engines coughed to life, the reactor whining with the strain. Henry sprinted back to his fighter, clambering into the cockpit. He slammed the neural link into his implant, wincing as the ship's damage reports flooded his mind. Gritting his teeth, he fired the thrusters, guiding the fighter back out of the hangar. The destroyer surged forward, its hull shimmering as its depleted shield struggled to hold back the storm of plasma fire. Henry jinked and wove, drawing the Cation's attention as the lumbering warship bore down on their flagship. Singh's voice crackled over the link, tight with strain. "Reactor's redlining, Captain. She's going to blow any second." "Get your people to the escape pods, Singh." Henry's voice was calm, focused. "I'll take it from here." Pods burst from the destroyer's flank as Henry pushed the engines to their limit. The flagship loomed before him, its shield flickering, its hull pitted and scarred. Henry angled for the command tower, the ship shuddering as it ploughed through the weakened shields. At the last instant, Henry wrenched the fighter away, the destroyer slamming into the tower in a blaze of light. The flagship reeled, secondary explosions marching across its length as the destroyer's reactor finally let go. The Cation formation buckled, ships scattering like frightened prey. The human fleet pounced, tearing into the disarrayed enemy with renewed ferocity. Henry let out a whoop of victory as the Cations fell back in disarray. Suddenly his fighter lurched, alarm screaming as a plasma bolt sheared through the shields. Henry wrestled with the controls, the ship tumbling end over end. Through the cracked canopy, he saw a Caitian cruiser powering towards him, its guns blazing. On the cruiser's bridge, a familiar figure stood snarling. Corvus, his face twisted with hate, rallied his battered ships for one final desperate charge. Henry wrenched his fighter into a wild spiral, trying desperately to bring his guns to bear. The cruiser filled his canopy, its forward batteries glowing like the eyes of an avenging demon. This was it, the final dance. One of them wouldn't be walking away from this. Henry bared his teeth in a feral grin, his finger tightening on the trigger. If he was going down, he was taking that feline bastard with him. The two ships hurtled towards each other, weapons blazing, hulls shuddering under the relentless barrage. Corvus's hate-filled visage filled Henry's screen, mirroring his own battle-maddened expression. There would be no quarter asked or given. Only one of them would emerge from this maelstrom. The fate of Earth, of the very future of humanity, hung in the balance. Henry roared his defiance as he charged headlong to meet his destiny, his guns spitting fire, his engines screaming. Corvus answered with a howl of rage, his cruiser shuddering as he pushed its battered engines to their limit. The distance between them vanished, the white-hot glare of their weapons filling the screen. Henry's world narrowed to that hate-filled face, to the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears, to the feel of the trigger beneath his finger. This was the moment, the final titanic clash of wills between two bitter foes. Henry's lips peeled back from his teeth as he hurtled towards his fate, Corvus's matching snarl filling his screen. Henry's fighter spun wildly as Corvus' cruiser filled his canopy, weapons blazing. With a shout of defiance, Henry jammed the trigger, his guns roaring to life. Bolts of superheated plasma ripped through the cruiser's weakened shields, blasting molten holes in its armored hide. Corvus roared in rage as his ship shuddered under the onslaught. His own guns flashed, stitching lines of fire across the fighter's hull. Armor plating shattered, exposing sparking wires and ruptured conduits. The two battered craft screamed past each other, close enough for Henry to glimpse the hate twisting Corvus's features through the cruiser's bridge viewports. The Caitian's eyes burned with the promise of vengeance. Henry's fighter reeled from the exchange, alarms shrieking as the ship bled air and fuel. Warning lights flashed red as the engines sputtered, life support failing. With a sinking heart, Henry knew the fighter would never make it back to the human fleet. But there was still one last card to play, one final desperate gambit. Gritting his teeth, Henry wrenched the fighter into a steep dive, aiming the crippled ship directly at the cruiser's pulsing reactor core. He slammed the throttle to full, afterburners flaring as the fighter hurtled forward on a kamikaze run. On the cruiser's bridge, Corvus's eyes widened in horrified realization. With a howl of mingled rage and desperation, he barked orders to evade, the cruiser lurching drunkenly as it tried to dodge the oncoming fighter. Henry braced for impact, the cruiser filling his canopy, looming larger and larger until it consumed his entire world. At the last possible instant, the cruiser wrenched to the side, the fighter's hull grazing its flank in a shower of sparks. And then the fighter was past, plunging directly into the cruiser's main hangar bay. The impact was titanic, the smaller craft crumpling like a tin can as it tore through bulkheads and support beams, finally grinding to a halt amid a twisted hellscape of flaming wreckage. For a long moment, there was only darkness and ringing silence. Then, miraculously, Henry stirred, his flight suit's emergency systems having deployed just in time. Every part of his body screamed in agony as he kicked open the fighter's cracked canopy, dragging himself out into the smoke-choked hangar. Alarms wailed like damned souls as the cruiser reeled from the devastating impact. Emergency lights flickered, casting distorted shadows across the nightmare of twisted metal and guttering fires. Somewhere above, Corvus's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with barely controlled fury as he ordered all hands to abandon ship. Henry staggered through the apocalyptic debris field, searching desperately for an escape pod, a shuttle, anything that could get him off this dying ship. Suddenly, a voice called his name, shocking in its familiarity. Whirling, Henry gaped in disbelief. Striding through the destruction, battered but alive, was Lieutenant Commander Singh, flanked by the haggard survivors of the destroyer. Their escape pods had crash-landed in the cruiser's hangar even as Henry made his kamikaze run. Singh gripped Henry's arm, his face grim. Corvus was still on the bridge, he relayed urgently, trying to steer the crippled cruiser on a collision course with the human flagship. If he succeeded, the Caitians might still steal victory from the jaws of defeat. Henry's jaw clenched. He knew what he had to do. Rallying Singh and the survivors, he led them in a desperate charge towards the cruiser's command deck, determined to stop Corvus once and for all. They battled their way through the disintegrating ship, cutting down Caitian crew and dodging cascades of debris at every turn. The cruiser bucked and convulsed around them like a wounded beast, consoles detonating in showers of sparks, bulkheads groaning as they warped and split. And through it all, one thought crystallized in Henry's mind, with diamond clarity. His final showdown with Corvus was fast approaching, a reckoning years in the making. Only one of them would walk away from it alive. Henry ducked plasma bolts that chewed through bulkheads as he sprinted for the bridge, Singh and the other survivors at his side. They burst through the hatch in a hail of gunfire. Caitian officers spun from their stations, scrambling for weapons. Corvus whirled from the helm, his yellow eyes blazing with hate at the sight of Henry. Singh and the others dove for cover, trading shots with the bridge crew. Henry charged Corvus, zigzagging through the firestorm. Corvus bellowed, leaping to meet him. They slammed together, a tangle of fists and claws. Henry hammered a punch into Corvus's stomach. The Caitian doubled over, then surged up, smashing his forehead into Henry's nose. Stars exploded across Henry's vision. He staggered back, blood streaming down his face. Corvus pressed his attack, slashing and gouging. Henry blocked desperately, Corvus's claws raking his forearms. The bridge spun crazily around them, consoles erupting in fountains of sparks, smoke billowing across the deck. "You're too late, human," Corvus spat, his voice thick with malice. "Your pathetic species is doomed. We will grind you to dust beneath our claws." Henry head-butted Corvus, feeling the crunch of cartilage. "You underestimate us," he snarled through bloody lips. "Humanity will never stop fighting. We'll never submit." With a roar, Henry bull-rushed Corvus. They struck the main viewports in a crash of splintering glass. The panel gave way, and suddenly they were tumbling through howling wind onto the cruiser's outer hull. Henry hit hard, skidding across the scorched metal. Corvus landed in a crouch, his lips peeled back in a feral snarl. The void gaped around them, the cruiser's containment fields crackling fitfully. They lunged at each other, hammering blows that would crush a human skull. Henry's ribs cracked under Corvus's onslaught. He spat blood, giving ground, his boots denting the hull. "Copy?" Henry grunted, blocking a punch that numbed his arm to the shoulder. "Get to the hangar, I'll be right behind you." "Not while I still breathe," Henry growled. Corvus was like a madman, lost to zealotry even as his ship died around him. Corvus leapt, claws extended to rip out Henry's throat. Henry twisted aside, seizing Corvus's arm and wrenching with all his strength. The Caitian shrieked as his momentum carried him over the edge into the void, his screams dopplering into silence. Henry slumped to his knees, every breath a spike of agony in his chest. The hull bucked and heaved beneath him, the cruiser shaking itself apart. Grinding his teeth, he dragged himself upright and staggered back towards the shattered viewports. The bridge was a storm of smoke and fire. Singh and the other survivors were nowhere to be seen, the crew lying still on the blood-slick deck. Alarms shrieked, the lights strobing red. Henry lurched through the madness, the cruiser's death throes intensifying with every step. The corridors were a nightmare, gravity fluctuating wildly. Bulkheads buckled, the air choked with fumes. Henry ricocheted off the walls, the deck pitching like a drunken carousel. Ahead, the hangar yawned open to space, a hurricane of escaping atmosphere. Singh and the others crouched behind a twisted girder at the hangar's edge, struggling to hold on. The wreckage of Henry's fighter lay crumpled nearby, escape pods burning on their launch racks. "The pods are gone," Singh shouted over the maelstrom. He pointed across the bay. "There, a shuttle!" Henry followed his gaze. A battered Cation craft squatted against the far wall, half buried in debris. It was their only chance. He signaled, and they pushed out from cover, fighting the howling wind. Air support beam gave way with a shriek of tortured metal. Tons of rubble plummeted from the hangar roof. Henry shoved Singh clear, throwing himself aside as the girder pulverized the deck where they'd been standing. Choking on dust, they clawed their way forward, the shuttle tantalizingly close. The hangar convulsed, great rents tearing open in the hull. Gouts of flame belched from ruptured conduits. The deck canted sickeningly, the hungry void pulling at them. Henry reached the shuttle, slamming the hatch controls. Nothing happened. He ripped open a maintenance panel, rerouting power from his suit. The hatch jerked and started to grind open. "Inside!" Henry roared, shoving the others through. Singh hauled him into the shuttle as a fuel line exploded, a fireball consuming the spot he'd just vacated. They piled into the cockpit, strapping into crash couches. Henry threw himself at the controls, coaxing the engines to life. The hangar collapsed around them, a hell of fire and shearing metal. The shuttle leapt forward, scraping the deck. Debris pinged off the hull like enraged hornets. Henry wrenched the stick, the shuttle clawing for altitude. Behind them, a white flash seared the viewports. The cruiser's reactor had finally let go. The shockwave caught them like a giant fist, sending them careening end over end. Alarms blared, the cabin whirling in a dizzying kaleidoscope. Henry clung to the bucking controls, his crashed ribs screaming. With a Herculean effort, he brought the nose up, straightening their spin. Silence fell, broken only by the wheezing of tortured lungs and the hiss of overloaded circuits. Henry sagged back in his chair, every muscle quivering with exhaustion. Outside the cracked viewports, the cruiser's funeral pyre lit the void, the debris field sparkling like macabre confetti. Singh stirred in the co-pilot's seat, his face a mask of soot and blood. He started to speak, but the comm pinged with an incoming hail. Henry reached out with a trembling hand, answering the call. Admiral Graves's haggard face filled the screen, his eyes widening as he took in their battered appearance. "Henry, my God, you made it. We'd almost given you up for lost." Henry tried to smile, his split lip reopening. "Takes more than a few cats to keep me down, Admiral." Henry closed his eyes, relief washing over him in a wave. It was over. They had won. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a fleeting respite. The Cations would be back, stronger and more vicious than ever. This war was far from finished. He opened his eyes, meeting the gazes of the battered survivors around him. In their faces he saw the same realization, the same grim determination. They had survived against all odds, had stood together in humanity's darkest hour. And no matter what came next, they would keep fighting, keep defying the dark until their last breath. Because that was what humans did. That was who they were. In the face of annihilation, in the jaws of defeat, they stood, they endured. The battered Cation shuttle shuddered as it settled into the human flagship's hangar bay, its hull pockmarked with scars from the titanic battle. Henry stumbled down the ramp, Singh and the other survivors close behind. The hangar deck erupted in cheers as the ragged group emerged, engineers and medics rushing forward to assist. Admiral Graves pushed through the throng, his face a mixture of relief and concern. He clasped Henry's hand firmly. "Damn good to see you, Captain. When we lost contact, we feared the worst." Henry started to reply, but a sudden commotion at the hangar entrance cut him off. A young communications officer burst in, his face ashen. "Admiral, urgent message from Earth. A massive Cation fleet has been detected entering the solar system. It dwarfs the force we just engaged." Graves's jaw tightened. He turned to Henry, his eyes hard. "Briefing room, now." In the briefing room, the mood was grim. The senior officers of the fleet stood around the holographic display, their faces etched with fatigue and stress. The display showed the solar system, a swarm of red dots on the edge, the Cation invasion fleet. "The Cations will reach Earth in less than 48 hours, Graves said, his voice tight. "Our ships are badly damaged, and reinforcements are still days away. We need options, people." The room erupted in a babble of voices as the officers threw out increasingly desperate suggestions. Henry listened, his mind racing. His gaze fell on Singh, who was staring intently at the star map, tracing a finger along a dense asteroid field. Suddenly it clicked. "The Percy field," Henry said, stepping forward. The room fell silent. "We lure the Caitians into the asteroid field, just like we did with their fighters at Arcadia. Once they're in, we hit them from behind with a strike team and catch them in a crossfire." Graves frowned, skeptical. "That's a huge risk, Captain. If it fails, Earth will be defenseless." Henry met his gaze unflinchingly. "If we don't do something bold, Earth will fall anyway. This is our best shot." As Henry laid out the details of his audacious plan, Graves's expression slowly shifted from doubt to grim determination. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. The fleet moved into position around the asteroid field, the battered ships forming up for what could be their final stand. In the hangar, Henry prepped his strike team, the pilots checking their ships with a fierce intensity. Suddenly the comm crackled to life. A voice filled with malice and hatred, instantly recognizable. Corvus. "Hear me, humans," the Caitian snarled, his breathing labored. "You think you've won, but you've only sealed your doom. I'm coming for you, and this time I will not stop until your worlds are ashes." Henry's hands clenched into fists. Corvus was alive, wounded but still a threat. A part of Henry felt a dark thrill at the prospect of facing his nemesis one last time. As the Caitian fleet entered the asteroid field, the human ships opened fire. The space rocks shattered under the barrage, spraying the enemy ships with deadly shrapnel. Corvus's fleet pushed forward, their shields straining. Henry's strike team warped in behind the Caitians. Corvus captured Shuttle in the lead. They tore into the enemy rear guard, their weapons flashing. Corvus's flagship loomed ahead, swinging its guns to face the new threat. Henry gunned the engines, aiming straight for the bridge. This was it, the final confrontation. Henry felt a wolfish grin spread across his face as he hurtled towards his foe. Corvus's face filled the view screen, twisted in rage. Only one of them would leave this battlefield. Henry swore it would be him. Henry jammed the thrusters to maximum, the battered Caitian shuttle shuddering as it shot through the dense asteroid field. Rocks ricocheted off the hull, warning lights flashing across the control panel. Henry gritted his teeth, adrenaline surging through his veins as he swerved and rolled, barely avoiding collision after collision. Behind him, Corvus's flagship loomed like a monstrous predator, its guns spewing plasma. The behemoth's armor glinted in the starlight, pockmarked from the battle but still terrifyingly intact. Henry yanked the stick, diving and spinning, the shuttle's more agile frame his only advantage against the flagship's raw firepower. "You can't run forever, human," Corvus's snarl crackled over the comms. "I'll chase you to the ends of the universe if I have to." Henry's hands flew over the controls, rerouting power from the shields to the engines. He had to stay one step ahead, had to keep the flagship's guns from locking on, but even as he juked and jinked, he could feel the shuttle losing steam, its reactor straining from the constant maneuvering. A lucky shot from the flagship grazed the shuttle's wing, alarms blaring as the small craft spun out of control. Henry fought with the stick, sparks showering from overloaded consoles. With a sinking realization, he knew he couldn't keep this up. Sooner or later, Corvus would run him down. Desperation mixed with grim resolve. Henry wrenched the shuttle into a hairpin turn, aiming the nose directly at the flagship's bridge. He diverted every scrap of power to the engines, the frame shaking as he pushed it past its limits. On the flagship's bridge, Corvus' eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in rage. "All guns, focus fire on that shuttle! Blast it out of the sky!" But it was too late. Henry gritted his teeth, bracing for impact as the shuttle hurtled towards the bridge like a spear. The flagship's guns roared, plasma splashing against the shuttle's hull, but Henry's aim was true. With a bone-jarring crash, the shuttle slammed into the command tower, metal screaming as it tore through bulkheads. Consoles detonated in showers of sparks, crew flung like ragdolls. On the bridge, Corvus was thrown from his command chair, slamming into the buckled deck with a howl of pain and fury. Dazed, bleeding from a dozen cuts, Corvus staggered to his feet. His eyes widened as a figure emerged from the smoke and ruin, a jagged shard of metal clutched in his hand. Henry, his face a mask of blood and determination, advanced on his nemesis. Corvus snatched a plasma rifle from a fallen guard, leveling it at Henry with a snarl. "You think this changes anything, ape? You think you've won?" They circled each other like wolves, the deck shuddering beneath their feet as the crippled flagship groaned around them. Bulkheads collapsed in sprays of sparks, fires raging out of control. "I think you still don't get it," Henry spat, his grip tightening on his improvised blade. "Humanity will never stop fighting. We'll never bow to you or anyone else." With a howl of rage, Corvus opened fire, plasma scorching the air. Henry dove for cover, rolling and weaving, closing the distance with each step. Corvus kept up a blistering barrage, but Henry was relentless, ignoring the shots that seared his flesh, his eyes fixed on his target. In a final lunge, Henry crashed into Corvus, the two enemies tumbling to the deck in a tangle of limbs. They traded blows with desperate savagery, fists and claws and elbows seeking any weakness. Henry slammed his forehead into Corvus's nose, felt bone crunch. Corvus raked his claws across Henry's face, drawing blood. And then Henry saw his chance. As Corvus reared back for a killing blow, Henry twisted aside, bringing his blade down in a vicious arc. The metal tore through flesh and bone, severing Corvus's arm at the elbow. Corvus reeled back, a howl of agony ripping from his throat. He clutched the bleeding stump, his eyes wild with pain and hate. Henry moved in to finish it, to put an end to his hated foe once and for all. But before he could strike, the deck bucked beneath them, a deep groan echoing through the ship. The flagship shuddered as secondary explosions tore through its hull, the reactors finally cracking under the strain of battle. Alarms shrieked, emergency lights flashing red. Henry staggered as the artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, the ship's death throes growing more violent by the second. He had to get out, had to get off this dying behemoth before it tore itself apart. He turned to run, but Corvus, half mad with pain and fury, lunged at him one last time. They grappled at the edge of a gaping chasm that had opened in the deck, the fires of the burning ship raging below. "Die with me, human," Corvus snarled, his claws scrabbling at Henry's throat. "If I fall, I'm taking you with me." With a final burst of desperate strength, Henry broke free of Corvus's grip, slamming his fist into the Caitian's jaw. Corvus tumbled back, disappearing into the inferno with a final hate-filled scream. Henry didn't look back. He sprinted for the shuttle bay, the ship coming apart around him. Bulkheads collapsed, flames roaring from ruptured conduits. He leapt over yawning chasms in the deck, the hungry void of space visible through the rents in the hull. He burst into the bay to find utter pandemonium, Caitian crew scrambling for the last few escape pods as the ship bucked and heaved. Henry spotted a single pod left, dashing towards it through a gauntlet of debris and explosions. But just as he reached it, a massive girder tore free from the ceiling, crashing down to block his path. Henry looked around frantically, searching for another route, but there was nothing. He was trapped. The deck shuddered beneath his feet, the fires closing in. Henry felt a grim resignation settle over him. After everything, this was how it ended. No blaze of glory, no final victory. Just a lonely death on a disintegrating ship, light years from home. Suddenly, impossibly, a familiar voice crackled over his comm unit. "Henry, Henry, can you hear me?" "Who else, you crazy bastard?" Laughter and relief warred in Singh's voice. "We saw your shuttle hit the flagship. Thought you were dead for sure." Henry looked up to see a battered human dropship, hovering just outside the force field, its hatch open. Singh waved at him from the troop bay, his face split in a wide grin. With a whoop of joy, Henry leapt for the hatch, Singh and the other survivors pulling him aboard just as the flagship exploded in a blinding flash. The shockwaves slammed into the dropship, sending it tumbling away from the expanding ball of debris and fire. As Singh wrestled with the controls, Henry collapsed against the bulkhead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked back at the receding fireball, watching as Corvus's flagship, the pride of the Caitian fleet, vanished in the inferno. It was over. Corvus was dead, his ship destroyed. The battle was won. But even as the thought formed, Henry knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The Caitian Empire was vast, its ambitions boundless. There would be other fleets, other commanders eager to take Corvus's place. The war was far from over. There would be other battles to fight, other sacrifices to make. But as Henry looked around at his battered, bleeding comrades, each one ready to go back into the fray, he felt a fierce surge of pride. This was humanity's strength, the quality that set them apart. They would never stop fighting, never give up, not as long as a single human heart still beat. No matter the odds, no matter the cost, they would struggle on. In the end, that was why they would win, why they would always triumph no matter how dark the hour, because surrender was not in their nature. It never had been, and it never would be. The Caitian shuttle slid into the docking bay of the human flagship, the clamps locking it in place with a metallic thunk. Henry staggered down the ramp, his body aching from a dozen wounds, Singh and the other survivors close behind. As they emerged into the hangar, a roar of cheers erupted from the assembled crew. Engineers, pilots, Marines, they all surged forward, their faces alight with joy and relief. "So you did it, Captain," a young ensign shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "You killed Corvus. The Caitian fleet is in full retreat." Henry managed a weary smile, clapping the ensign on the shoulder as he pushed through the crowd. But even as the celebrations washed over him, a cold weight settled in his gut. He had seen the toll this battle had taken. The hangar was a scene of controlled chaos, medics rushing to treat the wounded, damage control teams scrambling to patch ruptured bulkheads. And beyond the flagship's walls, the wreckage of shattered ships drifted in the void, a silent testament to the terrible cost of victory. Admiral Graves met them at the entrance to the bridge, his face lined with fatigue and grief. He clasped Henry's hand firmly, his eyes saying what his words could not. They had won, but the price had been staggering. In the briefing room, the mood was somber as Graves and the other senior officers took stock of their situation. The reports were grim. Over half the fleet destroyed or crippled, thousands of crew lost. And though they had repelled this Caitian offensive, everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy regrouped and struck again. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," Graves said heavily, the star map glowing behind him, a tapestry of red Caitian systems and blue human worlds. "The only reason we've held out this long is the tenacity and courage of soldiers like Captain Turner here. But courage alone won't win this war." The officers argued back and forth, proposing strategies and counter-strategies, their voices rising with each failed idea. Reinforce the border worlds. The Caitians would simply go around them. Pull back to the core systems? That would only delay the inevitable. Henry listened, his heart growing heavier with each word. They were talking in circles, desperately trying to stave off the realization that was looming over them all, that against an enemy like the Caitians, with their vast numbers and superior technology, there might not be a path to victory. That humanity, for all its stubborn refusal to yield, might finally have met its match. And then, in a moment of crystal clarity, Henry saw it. The only move left on the board. The only way to end this conflict once and for all. Graves frowned, concern etching his features. "A direct assault on the Caitian homeworld? That's suicide, Captain. We barely have the ships to defend our own borders." "It's the only way," Henry insisted, a feverish intensity burning in his eyes. "As long as their leadership is intact, as long as their industrial base is untouched, they'll keep coming. We have to cut the head off the snake." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, the magnitude of what Henry was proposing sinking in. To launch an all-out attack on the heart of the Caitian Empire, to send every ship and soldier they had on what would almost certainly be a one-way trip. It was an act of desperation, a gamble with the highest possible stakes. But as Henry laid out his plan, as he spoke of striking a blow that would shatter the Caitians' resolve and bring them to the negotiating table, A flicker of hope began to stir in the room. It was a chance, however slim, to end this war and secure humanity's future. And in a conflict that had already cost them so much, what did they have left to lose? Graves studied the star map, his jaw tight with tension. Finally he nodded. "It's a hell of a long shot," he said, "but it might be the only shot we have. All right, Captain. You've got your green light. Assemble your team and prepare the fleet. We launch in 48 hours. As the meeting broke up and the officers dispersed to their duties, Henry lingered for a moment, staring at the glowing map. The Cation homeworld pulsed red at the center, a malevolent heart beating with the promise of fire and blood. He thought of all the friends he had lost, all the innocents who had suffered and died in this brutal war. He thought of the generations to come, the children who might grow up never knowing the specter of Cation aggression, if only he could succeed in this final desperate mission. He closed his eyes, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. So much depended on him now, the fate of his crew, his species, his very way of life. But he would not shrink from this duty. He would see it through to the end, whatever the cost. With a last lingering look at the star map, Henry turned and strode from the briefing room, his footsteps echoing on the metal deck. There was no more time for doubt or hesitation. The die was cast, the course was set. One way or another, this war would end at the heart of the Cation Empire. In the hours that followed, the fleet was a hive of frantic activity as ships were rearmed and repaired, soldiers drilled and briefed. Henry oversaw it all, his presence a constant reminder of the monumental task that lay ahead. He spoke with his pilots, his marines, his engineers, looking each one in the eye, impressing upon them the gravity of what they were about to attempt. Some met his gaze with fear, others with grim determination, but all with the understanding that this was the moment they had trained for, the defining test of their mettle. As the final preparations were made, and the fleet prepared to depart, Henry stole a moment to himself, standing at the observation deck and staring out at the stars. In the distance, the Cation homeworld glimmered, a baleful red eye promising death and destruction. But Henry's thoughts were elsewhere, dwelling on the faces of those he had lost. Ramos, his loyal friend, cut down on that fateful mission. The brave men and women who had followed him into battle time and time again, never wavering, never questioning. They had given their lives for the cause, for the dream of a universe where humanity could live free from fear. Now it was up to him to make sure their sacrifices had not been in vain, to lead this final charge and bring an end to this conflict once and for all. It was a burden that weighed heavily on him, but one he bore gladly. For them, for all of humanity, he would see this through to the bitter end. The deck shuddered beneath his feet as the fleet began to move, the ships falling into formation as they prepared to make the jump to warp. Henry closed his eyes, picturing the battles to come, the fire and fury that awaited them. There would be losses, he knew, more friends to mourn, more names to carve into the wall of remembrance. But if they could strike the decisive blow, if they could break the Cation war machine and force them to the table, then perhaps, just perhaps, it would all be worth it. He opened his eyes, his gaze hardening with resolve. It was time to face the fire, to dance with death in the cold void of space, time to make a stand for all that he believed in, all that made life worth living. With a last silent prayer for the fallen, Henry turned and made his way to the bridge, ready to lead his fleet into the maelstrom. The stars streaked by as they leapt to warp, hurtling towards the heart of the enemy, towards the crucible that would forge the fate of nations. And on the bridge of his ship, standing tall and proud before the view screen filled with the swirling vortex of warp space, Captain Henry Turner, hero of the human resistance, prepared to meet his destiny head-on. The battle that followed was like nothing any of them had ever seen before, a seething cauldron of destruction that lit the void for light years in every direction. The Cations threw everything they had at the human fleet, waves of fighters and bombers swarming from their carriers like angry insects, capital ships trading blistering broadsides at point-blank range. The space around their homeworld became a kaleidoscopic hell of searing beams, missile contrails, and expanding fields of debris as ships on both sides were ripped apart in the furious exchange. At the heart of the maelstrom, Henry's ship danced and wove, its guns never falling silent as it tore into the Caitian ranks. His crew worked with a desperate efficiency, damage control teams racing to seal breaches and douse fires even as fresh wounds were carved into the hull. On the bridge, Henry barked orders and countermands, his eyes flicking from one tactical display to the next, absorbing the flow of the battle and adjusting his strategy on the fly. They were taking losses, he saw with a sinking heart. Human ships vanishing from the scope in bursts of static, their crews consigned to the cold embrace of the void. But they were giving as good as they got, Caitian vessels blooming into clouds of shrapnel under the relentless onslaught of human weaponry. And then, as the battle reached a fever pitch, Henry saw it. A gap in the Caitian lines, a path that led straight to their command ship. The massive dreadnought hung at the rear of the formation, directing the fight with cold precision, its shields a shimmering barrier against the fury of the human assault. Henry knew this was his chance, perhaps the only one he would get. With a wordless battle cry, he wrenched his ship onto a new heading, diving straight for the heart of the enemy. His guns hammered at the command ship's defenses, missiles and beams splashing against the flickering shields. Around him, his escort ships fought like demons, hurling themselves at the Caitian defenders with reckless abandon. But even as they closed the distance, disaster struck. A lucky shot from a Caitian cruiser punched through his ship's armor, the bridge exploding in a shower of sparks and shrapnel. Consoles burst into flames, crewmen screaming as they were cut down by the blast. Henry himself was thrown from his chair, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Dazed, ears ringing, he pulled himself upright, taking in the scene of destruction with a growing sense of dread. Main power was offline, weapons unresponsive. They were dead in space, a sitting duck for the Caitian guns. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Henry felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He knew what he had to do, the only play he had left. With a grim smile he staggered to the helm, his fingers flying over the controls as he set a new course, straight for the command ship's exposed bridge. His crew looked at him in confusion and growing understanding as he armed the self-destruct, the timer flashing red on the cracked view screen. They knew what he intended, what he was asking of them. And to a man, they stood with him, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for the cause they believed in. As the timer ticked down and the command ship loomed larger, filling the screen, Henry felt a sense of peace wash over him. He thought of all those he had lost, all those he had fought for, his family, his friends, his comrades in arms. They were with him now in these final moments, their strength and courage flowing through him. He closed his eyes, picturing their faces one last time. Ramos grinning around a cigar, Singh steady and unflappable at his side, the countless others who had stood with him, fought with him, died for him. They had given him so much, and now it was time to repay that debt. The timer hit 0, and the world vanished in a blaze of searing white light. Henry felt the heat wash over him, felt the shockwave lift him from his feet and hurl him into oblivion. And then he felt nothing at all, the roar of the explosion fading to a distant whisper as the darkness claimed him. In the void above the Caitian homeworld, a new sun bloomed, a cataclysmic fusion of matter and energy that vaporized the command ship in an instant. The shockwave rippled outward, catching the nearby Caitian ships and tearing them apart like leaves in a hurricane, and in the heart of that maelstrom, the battered remains of the human fleet watched in stunned silence as their enemy's strength was snuffed out in a single blinding instant. As the light faded and the debris settled, a ragged cheer went up from the human ships. They had done it. Against all odds, against an enemy that had seemed invincible, they had struck the decisive blow. The Caitian war machine was broken, its leadership shattered. The war was over. But even as they celebrated, even as they wept with relief and joy, a somber realization began to settle over the fleet. The cost of this victory had been staggering, the sacrifice immeasurable. So many ships lost, so many lives cut short, and at the heart of it all, the man who had made it possible, who had led them to this moment with unwavering courage and resolve. But even as they mourned, the survivors knew that Henry's sacrifice had not been in vain, that his legacy would live on, a shining beacon of hope and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. He had shown them what they were capable of, what lengths they could go to when everything they held dear was on the line. And as they limped back to Earth, their ships battered and broken but their spirits unbroken, they carried with them the memory of Henry's courage, his unwavering commitment to the cause. They had won the war, but the true victory was in the example he had set, the standard he had raised for all those who would come after. In the years that followed, as humanity rebuilt and recovered, as they spread out among the stars and forged a new destiny for themselves, they would look back on this moment as the turning point, the crucible in which their future was forged. And always, at the center of that memory would be the man who had made it all possible, the man who had given everything for the sake of his people, his planet, his species. Captain Henry Turner, the hero of humanity, the legend who would never be forgotten. His story would be told and retold, passed down from generation to generation as a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human race. And though he was gone, his presence would always be felt, a guiding light in the darkness, a reminder of what they had fought for and what they had won. For in the end, that was Henry's true legacy, not the battles he had fought or the enemies he had vanquished, but the idea he had championed, the belief that had sustained him through the darkest of times. The belief that no matter the odds, no matter the opposition, humanity would always find a way, that they would never ever give up, not as long as a single human heart still beat. That was the lesson they had learned, the truth they had earned in the blood and fire and sacrifice of war, and it was a truth they would carry with them always, a flame burning bright in the heart of every man, woman, and child who called themselves human. For they were the inheritors of Henry's dream, the guardians of his vision, and as long as they held fast to that dream, as long as they remembered the price that had been paid for their freedom, then Henry Turner would never truly die. He would live on in the spirit of his people, in the unbreakable will that had carried them through the darkness and into the light. And though the road ahead would be long and hard, though there would be challenges and obstacles yet to come, they would face them as they always had, with courage and determination, with the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves. They were human, and they would never ever surrender. That was Henry's gift to them, his enduring legacy, and it was a legacy that would live on forever, as bright and unquenchable as the stars themselves. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.